Forget the banquet hall with its painted myths. Start beside the smoking hearth instead. Morning enters through shutters carrying damp straw and wood smoke. A pot already trembles above the fire. Inside it is the real medieval menu. Not endless roast meat, but survival simmering all day. Bread waits on the table like another tool. A clouds the cup, dull and nourishing. Outside, fields decide what everyone tastes, and the church decides what disappears. For most medieval people, daily food was simple. It had to fuel labor first. The famous feasts existed, but rarely. Ordinary eating happened far from painted manuscripts and courtly songs. Most households built meals from grain. Grain became bread, porridge, gruel, cakes, or pottage. That word, pottage, meant a thick simmering dish. It was dinner, insurance, and routine. The pot could hold peas, beans, leeks, or cabbage. Oats or barley might thicken it. Sometimes there was meat in it. Sometimes only sin flavor remained from yesterday's bones. This is the first surprise about medieval food. It was repetitive, but not always empty. Archaeology and household records show variety. It was modest variety, tied to season, weather, and wages. A peasant in England did not eat like a merchant. A Florentine artisan ate differently again. Still, across much of medieval Europe, staples repeated. Bread, ale, and pottage formed the center. The day usually began before full light. Food had to fit prayer and work. Breakfast was not always a formal rite. Many adults waited for the main midday meal. Yet laborers, travelers, and children often ate earlier. Hard work did not respect ideals. That early food might be bread and ale. It might be leftover pottage still warm. To modern ears, ale at breakfast sounds wild. Medieval ale was often weaker than today. It also carried calories and comfort. For working bodies, liquid grain absolutely counted. Good water was used where sources were trusted, but ale stored well and fed people. That matters in a world without refrigeration. So to smoke, salt, storage, and habit. By late morning, the main meal approached. In many places, that meal was dinner. Dinner meant the largest daily serving. Supper came later, usually lighter before darkness deepened. What sat on the table first? Usually bread, and often plenty of it. Bread was not a side dish. Bread was the meal's backbone and bargaining chip. Status could be seen in the loaf itself. Fine white wheat bread signaled money. Darker loaves of rye, barley, oats, or maslin signaled thrift. Maslin mixed grains together. Even the plate might be bread. A trencher soaked up juices beneath meat, fish, or stew. Afterward, it could be eaten, or given away to poor people or dogs. Poorer households did not always bake tall loaves. Flatbreads, bannocks, and oat cakes mattered too. And grain did not always become bread. Very often, it went straight into the pot. Porridge and fermenty filled stomachs cheaply. They were soft, hot, filling, and easy on weak teeth. The medieval kitchen loved what could stretch. One handful became enough for several mouths. Vegetables were not decorative extras. They were daily companions to grain, especially in leaner households. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, and beans appear constantly. So do herbs from small plots. If a family had a garden, it mattered. If they had a pig, it mattered more. But even pigs were savings accounts. Slaughter came at chosen moments, not every ordinary supper. So meat was irregular for many villagers. It was certainly not unknown. At West Cotton in England, residue analysis found peasant pottages with beef and mutton. Reality was less tidy than myth. The old stereotype says peasants never tasted meat. The evidence says many tasted some sometimes. Usually not lavish cuts, and not daily, but bones, fats, and scraps still entered the pot. Poultry might appear around homes with chickens. Eggs added welcome protein when hens actually cooperated. Dairy mattered more than many modern images suggest. Milk, butter, and simple cheeses were important. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so much became something else. Cheese traveled better than a bucket. Green cheese, soft and young, appears in sources. So do buttermilk, curd, and simple fresh dairy. For the poor, these foods were precious. For the rich, the same foods felt commonplace. Fruit also sat closer to daily life than people imagine. Apples, pears, plums, berries, and nuts arrived seasonally. Fresh fruit was local and fleeting. Dried fruit lasted longer if you had enough. Honey sweetened food when sugar remained expensive. White sugar was still a luxury product. So the medieval sweet tooth certainly existed. It simply lived inside stricter material limits. Then there was fish, and fish changed everything, not because everyone loved it, but because religion demanded it. The church calendar cut the year into meat days and fast days. On many fast days, flesh vanished. Then tables turned toward fish, dairy substitutes, or plain vegetable dishes. Friday could change the entire kitchen. Lent changed it for weeks. The menu bent around belief as much as appetite. That meant herring, eel, cod, or local freshwater catch. Preserved fish fed places far from coasts. Salted, smoked, and dried foods mattered enormously. Preservation was the hidden technology of the medieval table. Could you last on bread, ale, and pottage all winter? Tell me below. And be honest about the fasting days. They changed everything about the weekly table. Because the strangest truth is this: medieval eating was shaped by rules as much as hunger. In towns, food could look a little different. Markets widened choice, if money allowed. Urban households bought bread they did not bake. Some even bought hot meals. Public cookshops served people without proper hearths. Medieval takeaway existed, just with soutier walls. City dwellers might access more fish or offcuts. They might also face higher prices. Craftsmen often ate better than field laborers. Income and location mattered almost as much as rank. Still, the rhythm remained familiar. Grain came first, then whatever the purse could invite. For wealthier people, daily food expanded rather than transformed. They still ate bread, fish, and stew. But their bread was whiter. Their tables were richer with meat, wine, and spice. Pepper, saffron, sugar, and imported wine announced distance and money. Taste itself could display status. Elite kitchens also pursued texture and spectacle. Color mattered, arrangement mattered, surprise mattered. Yet even among nobles, not every meal was a coronation. Feast food was exceptional by design. Most days were more orderly. Great households ran on schedules, stores, and accounting. They still followed fasts. They still watched the seasons with anxious attention. Winter narrowed the menu for everyone. By late winter, freshness could feel very far away. That hungry stretch before spring had a reputation. Stores thinned, gardens slept, and appetite stayed awake. Then spring loosened the table. Eggs, herbs, lamb, and young greens slowly returned. Summer meant labor and abundance together. Autumn meant harvest, slaughter, and preserving for what followed. So when people ask what medieval food tasted like, the real answer is time. Every month tasted different. Even smell changed with the calendar. Fresh hay and onions were not salted herring and smoke. Cooking itself happened close to danger. Open flames, heavy pots, and constant smoke framed every meal. A household fire was precious. Keeping it alive saved wood, labor, and mourning time. That is why the ever-simmering pot matters so much. It turned scraps into continuity. Yesterday's broth welcomed today's leaks. Today's bones promised tomorrow's deeper flavor. Nothing about this was romantic in the moment. It was practical, repetitive, and necessary. But practical does not mean joyless. Warm food after labor still felt like relief. So did fresh bread. So did a little bacon fat or dripping. Children learned these tastes early. Age did not excuse anyone from the grain economy. The old and the sick needed softer foods. Gruel, broth, and softened bread answered that need. Well, spices were not only for vanity. They could also mark medicine, comfort, or theory. Medieval people thought carefully about balance in food. Hot, cold, moist, and dry mattered. That medical thinking shaped elite diets especially, but everyone knew some foods suited some bodies. No one in the Middle Ages called it protein. Still, they understood strength and satiety. Beans helped daily. Cheese helped too. Allah helped constantly. And yes, people snacked sometimes, but moralists simply frowned on eating at improper times. Much food was meant to be consumed publicly. A lord's generosity had to be seen. That public element matters greatly. Meals displayed order, obligation, generosity, and belonging. Who cut the meat mattered deeply. Who sat highest mattered too. Yet for common people, daily eating was usually intimate. Family, workmates, and neighbors shared what was there. A spoon moving to one pot could define a household. So could the size of the loaf. If harvest failed, those measures tightened fast. Medieval diet was never far from uncertainty. That is another myth worth breaking. People were not ignorant of nutrition. They were vulnerable to shortage. They preserved, bartered, planted, brewed, and stretched. They did not simply endure at random. Women especially carried much of this labor. Brewing, dairying, baking, and garden work fed families. So when we picture medieval food, we should picture work. Every bite began long before the table. Plowing, sowing, milking, chopping, salting, stirring. The meal was only the final chapter. Even celebration depended on ordinary storage. Without daily discipline, there was no feast day. And feast days did come. That is exactly why plain days mattered so much. A holiday table could offer more meat, finer bread, and sweeter dishes. The memory lasted because contrast was real. But the title of this story is Daily Life. Daily life belongs to the loaf and pot. If you walked into most homes unannounced, you would not find peacock. You would smell grain and onions. You would hear a ladle against clay. You would see bread measured with practiced care. In the Mediterranean world, olive oil and wine stood stronger. In the north, butter, ale, rye, and oats often dominated. So there was no single medieval menu. There were overlapping habits, ingredients, and expectations. That is why broad claims mislead us. Medieval Europe was never one kitchen. Still, the shared pattern remains striking. Daily calories came mostly from grain. Protein often came second-hand through legumes, dairy, or fish. Meat was valuable, but not always central. For many laboring people, food was astonishingly functional. Yet function can still carry culture. Recipes traveled with trade routes. Fasts traveled with faith and authority. Even conquest did not erase older habits overnight. Archaeologists find continuity where we expect dramatic change. The Norman conquest, for example, changed power faster than peasant cooking. Ordinary diets often moved slowly. Then plague disrupted that slow world. After the Black Death, some survivors could command better diets. With fewer mouths and altered wages, meats sometimes reached wider tables, not everywhere and not equally. So the medieval diet was never frozen. It shifted with climate, disease, trade, and law. But through those centuries, the daily meal stayed recognizable. Bread beside a bowl, a drink beside both. That is the lost realism behind the Middle Ages. Not constant feasting, but constant making do. And maybe that is why the food feels familiar. Most humans have lived closer to necessity than luxury. A hot pot, a shared loaf, a little hope. That was enough to anchor a day. Could you live on that rhythm for one winter? Tell me in the comments. Want more journeys into the past? Subscribe and ring the bell. The feast fades first. The humble loaf remembers everything.